TEFAF Coffee Talk, particularly on this morning talking about restraining and advancing women in post-war America. I've actually changed the title slightly online to say from housecoats to stilettos, which I think is a more alluring title, and I don't know how I missed out on that before. Stephen Ferm is somebody now who is a good friend of TEFAF. He moderated a panel in the first spring fair last year, and it was such a great success that I asked him to provide some more ideas for us. And over a few meetings, we came up with this one, and this is a dynamite panel, so I know that you're going to really enjoy listening to these wonderful experts who are not only dynamic women in their own right, but also incredibly witty and charming. Am I right? So I'll turn it over to Stephen, who is Associate Professor of Fashion and Design at Parsons School of Design.
So thank you again and warm welcome. This is quite a topic because in such a short amount of time, women went through so much change. And we're going to talk about the years from 1947 to roughly 1970 and a little bit beyond, particularly where we are today with the Me Too movement. And so in those few short years, women's ideals went from those of Donna Reed to Twiggy to Gloria Steinem. And we're going to take those ideals about women and how they changed and talk about art, design, and media and how they manifested. And so allow me to introduce our panelists. Michelle Fillmore is the Penny Vinker Curator of Fashion Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She previously held posts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute and Sotheby's Auction House. Her books include Hollywood Before Glamour, Fashion in American Silent Film, and the co-author Jewelry by Artists in the Studio, 1940 to 2000. Her recent exhibitions at the MFA include #Textile, Hollywood Glamour, Fashion and Jewelry from the Silver Screen, and Think Pink. And aside from being a scholar, she's also a teacher. She has taught courses on fashion, design, and film history at Rhode Island School of Design and the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Catherine Zuber, to my right, is a costume designer for Broadway theater and opera, among other venues. She's been nominated 14 times for a Tony Award and has won 6 times. In addition to receiving other multiple awards, she has designed for over 120 shows. Some of her recent include South Pacific, Golden Boy, The King and I, my favorite, War Paint, and most recently, My Fair Lady, for which she's nominated for a Tony Award, and we'll be watching that on June 10th. Shannon Bell Price is a fashion and design historian, curator, and educator with 20 years of leadership experience in nonprofit, cultural, and academic institutions. She was an associate research curator under Harold Koda and Andrew Bolton for over a decade at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Costume Institute. And following this, Shannon entered education, first at Pratt Institute as the assistant chair of fashion design, and then as the assistant dean of design, before coming to Parsons, where she's currently the director of external projects and manages the Parsons Study Collection of garments, of historical garments. And lastly, Michelle Fisher is the Louis Madeira IV Assistant Curator of European Decorative Arts and Design at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. She's held positions with the Guggenheim Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and recently with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where she co-organized the exhibition Items, Is Fashion Modern?, thus leading to Fisher Research Fashion extensively. She's also taught at CUNY's Baruch College and Harvard University, and in 2011, she founded the online platform arthistoryteachingresources.org, now used in over 185 countries. Her research centers on the social histories of design, architecture, and the intersections of contemporary art, museum, and art pedagogy. So welcome, panelists. I think to begin, we want to talk right before 1947. What's happening? Well, of course, it's World War II, and women have relative freedom. The men are away, they're on the front, and women are here, they're entering jobs, they're seemingly wearing pants. My goodness, how subversive. And so what they're wearing at the time, what is that saying about women? How is fashion talking about women's identities and their roles?
So
post-World War II?
Pre.
So pre-World War II, okay, yeah.
Or even during World War
Or
II.
even during World War II, yeah. I mean, I think there are a number of ways you could kind of approach it, but certainly when you think about what they were wearing and what they were doing in the World War II era, they were actually moving into wartime jobs to help the war effort, and the clothing really reflected that. So you think about that kind of military styling and the less structured garments. That was very, kind of par for the course at that stage, because they really were participating more fully in life, as opposed to what happens kind of post, not, at least work life, I guess, for the war effort. So I don't know, yeah.
In some ways, they're also really experimenting themselves, right? It's not something that they're being told to wear. They have to. I'm thinking of something like tights or nylons, for example. So when the material is restricted because of the war effort, you have women, painting their legs or finding new ways to create parts of fashion that they're missing because of the current straitened circumstances. And so it's not really always, at that point in time, a top-down initiative. It's something that they're really kind of making for themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
Also, I really don't think women had much of a choice in terms of what they could wear because of rationing. There were
Yes.
ration books, and there were points given to each woman in terms of where she wanted to use her points. So like a dress with maybe too many pleats would use up 2 extra points. So you had to think about how you were rationing your rations to create your look. And what's interesting is that in the UK, they developed utility dress because maybe the initial attempts of people trying to work with these ration books were a little bit dodgy. So they sort of came up with actual designs that you could choose where it used the right amount of fabrics. It was very prescriptive. It was 2 yards for a dress, 2 1/4 for a coat, 2 1/2 for a suit. You can only have 2 pockets, no buttons, no metal zippers. It was quite rigid. And what was interesting is that there were no restrictions on millinery. So I feel that women, that's where they really had a lot of fun. The hats, you could go to town on your hat. So there was all sorts of frippery, and I love the hats of that time period, and I think it's because that was the one place where you could have some freedom. Also, the development of in the UK, there was the siren suit, so that if there was an emergency, you could put on this kind of jumpsuit that was allowed to have pockets, so you could put everything you needed in your pockets and go to a fallout shelter. And I think from that developed the ease that women had in wearing trousers, and it became something that they enjoyed wearing. So I think there was it was like, in a way, restriction created creativity.
And freedom, in a way.
And freedom.
Yeah. I know, I think about the undergarments of the time, too, because a lot of the boning, for example, in the corsetry or undergarments was restricted, as well as rubber and elastic.
Yeah.
And so actually, you couldn't really, when you think about post-war, it's a really, really, kind of tight silhouette. It's very overly feminine, and you go back to the corsetry and the boning and the stricture. And in the wartime, you didn't have access to that. So it really did affect from the kind of your undergarments out.
Yes.
A more freeing silhouette in many ways. Yeah.
So that takes us, it's 1945, the war ends, Paris is starting to celebrate, women want to feel the way they did, and without the restrictions of points. And so what happens in 1947? Why is this so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back, is this working? Yeah, it's okay. Just 2 seconds. I think that we often all forget, I mean, not most people in this room probably, but how much economy affected the silhouette in the 40s, so I mean there were narrow skirts and suit jackets which were kind of emulating this masculine look with the shoulders and everything like that. So there was this kind of like professional outward appearance, but it was also that slim silhouette that was really just because of yardage, like you were talking about the restrictions. And so I think sometimes, as people who study fashion history, it can be very easy just to attach yourself to a silhouette and kind of memorizing it that way. But all these like layers of technology and economics have so much impact on the silhouettes, on the materials, on the undergarments, on everything else that really can change the way women look outside of, just like what makes women, feel pretty, or what do they feel like wearing, or, the things that fashion often are, seen through the lens of, especially today. But in the post-war, and I only bring that up just to say that in the post-war period when you know, the economy picked up again and the rationing stopped and the new look came in, it was, you know, I think that there's, right, this whole, you know, feminist narrative, which is totally there about, you know, about taking them back, or, you know, on either side of the feminist argue, taking them back to like a pre-war idea of femininity, and they're coming back, you know, they're coming back out of the workforce, and so re-engaging with the home life and re-engaging with their kind of feminine responsibilities and, you know, at home and things like that. But I think it's also a bit about a lot of the women also just wanting to re-engage with fashion from a sort of fun, exuberant, feminine way. So there's like the extreme version of Dior, who was trying to give that back to women in his way from a design perspective and from a sort of just like joie de vivre of post-war period and fabrications and stuff. But I think that there was also something to women re-engaging with that, either out of necessity because they were kicked out of the workforce, or, you know, maybe even, you know, to a certain degree, to a bit of relief of being able to have a full skirt again and not have somebody be telling you how many pockets and pleats you can have and all of that, you know, so.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, that silhouette is always kind of looked at as being overtly feminine, because it really is kind of the full bust, the cinched waist, the full hips, right? And if you actually look at garments from that era, it's not only these undergarments where you're kind of going back to corsetry that was kind of banished in the 20s, and all of a sudden we're back in, you know, kind of this, almost these boned undergarments, but you look at the actual garments in museum collections, and there's padding in the hips, and there, almost every brassiere or corseteer or Merry Widow has padding in the breasts, and your waist is cinched, and so it really is this kind of overtly feminine look that, you know, Christian Dior called his women flowers. And it really is this very direct reference to kind of women and kind of going back to their natural state as a mother and a homemaker. So it's kind of, you know, like Simone de Beauvoir and kind of writes, she actually wrote an article in Vogue in 1947, right around this time, and kind of criticizing this kind of way of looking at women as flowers, as precious, you know, and what does that do, and how does that position them in the world? And it's all there in the clothes as well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Definitely, yeah.
And in the design, the gadgetry, the design of the suburban home. If we're thinking about advancing and restricting this in sort of 45, 47 onwards is the boom of suburbia, and the moment in time when tract houses became very much a part of American discourse and other countries around the world. Thinking about advancing and restricting, I think it's really important. In terms of just the very first thing you think about with suburbia is that it was enfranchised by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, from the Great Depression onwards, actually. So they became really the bankroller of this as a landscape in the States, and of course the FHA didn't loan to any non-whites. And so thinking about advancing or restricting, we're also thinking about a very specific landscape that was played out along racial lines, not just along lines of technology, of other types of landscapes. So in the suburban home, these woman flowers were crystallized almost, the Stepford wives. And my work, I've looked quite extensively, not just at Levittown actually, which is probably the suburban home's best known on the East Coast, but at Joseph Eichler's homes on the West Coast that were kind of a step above. They were really fantastic. Steve Jobs grew up in a Eichler, not an Eichler home, but something very much like it. They were often designed by quite young but very forward-thinking architects like Antonin Allen or Raphael Soriano, for example. And on the West Coast, they were these wonderful, beautiful houses that had quite high design finishes, high design interiors. They were sold all glass interiors. They very much, Eichler had lived briefly in a Frank Lloyd Wright Usonian home, and sort of took that connection between interior and the exterior outdoor life, but also was really interested, also like Wright, in Japanese design. And so these homes often came with atriums in the middle of them, and the rooms were spread out in such a way that wherever you were, you always had this sort of central command post. And so that was often the language used when women were talked about in these houses. They were the commanders-in-chief of this particular domestic space. But of course, they were also away from any amenities. Suburban areas didn't often have lots of street activity unless it was the children going out to play. So it was an interesting atmosphere, certainly.
Well, it makes me think of women truly being restricted away from others and kind of not quite a convent, but being sequestered.
It's the era of the princess telephone. This is also the design in the late 50s. And so this was when suburban homes and homes in general of the middle class nature in the States had more than one telephone. And so design innovation there, you start to be able to call people, so you're not seeing them necessarily in person, but you're able to make your arrangements for the local committee or whatever you're doing, the home bake, whatever it is, over the phone, the local community pool, and then of course your kids are out playing on the streets, so you're out then marshalling that or bringing them from home to home. So
fascinating.
Yeah, and there's really, it's amazing when you look at, say, guides to dress in that era, kind of how tightly conscripted it is for different times of the day, different events, different activities. And there's this great book by Anne Fogarty, who was a fashion designer, very successful fashion designer. It's called Wife Dressing. And if you read it, if you are a feminist, you will just cringe, because it's all about, you know, women, their places in the home. They're supposed to dress to kind of match their interior. Even, I mean, it's astonishing. And really the ultimate goal, as she called it, was complete femininity. And it's all based in that home life, you know, so.
Well,
Yeah.
Betty Friedan then,
Exactly,
and in a metaphor
yes.
that we would find deeply uncomfortable today, perhaps calls these homes concentration camps for women. And so it becomes this extremely, a huge rejection of that particular ethos.
Right.
Well, whenever I think of the Dior's new look and the corset, and even in costume, the act of dressing and how that's a certain psychology, the idea that you don't throw something on and 20 minutes later you're out the door, that it takes an hour. Yes. And I'm thinking of a friend who's an actress, actually, and she did a period piece that was around 1900, and she was talking about these very large hats and how you had to move your head very slowly. And just that speed is a real psychology. So how would the act of dressing keep women in their roles, or what happened after the new look?
Talking about what happened in the long run.
That was a big question.
Yeah, I was like, oh God, everything happened after the new look.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things too that I was thinking about as we were, you know, I was reading everybody else's kind of areas of interest and everything, and this kind of can bring us into the 60s and stuff a bit where, right, clearly everything goes a bit mad. But one of the things that was happening concurrently with the new look was also the birth of the pre-60s youth culture, and also subcultural style was really, you know, growing out of, right, the zoot suit era and things like that, little pockets of it. But, you know, one of the first big ones was the teddy boy movement. That was kind of inspired from Edwardian style, and the girls called Judy's like had this great kind of melange of the male style, wearing the jeans, but also with, you know, they totally took on board the big skirts. And the thing that's quite interesting about it is that even though they were young and they were often coming from poorer parts of London and everything, they were embracing this kind of new look ethos and post-war ethos about exuberance and excess in fashion. So they were challenging gender norms, and they were challenging class and social mores, but they were also really engaged with this, you know, idea of using fashion as a way to enjoy life and show your personality and show your engagement with, you know, with art and fashion and music, and that kind of connection of art, fashion, music through youth, through the, you know, the idea of the teenager, which was quite a new concept at that time, really took hold, and then of course like brought us into the 60s, where it became like the motivating economic factor, you know, due to the baby boom and everything else, which not only changed, you know, the economy and how the youth spent their money, but of course they were driving the conversation about fashion and what they wanted to wear and how they wanted to express their sexuality, their gender, and everything else through their clothes and through the choices that they made.
I think one of the points about Dior's new look is that it was very rarefied.
Totally,
And
absolutely,
what was happening in the US was very different than what was happening in Europe, because US wasn't affected physically by the war the way that Italy and France and the UK and Germany, the way that they were involved in Reconstruction. In the 50s, there were still rations in the UK. I was a child in the UK in the 50s, and I had rations as a child, and it was, I think what was happening here in the US was a very, very idealized approach. I don't think in those countries that women could be treated in quite the same geisha style. There wasn't the room for that. Things were still very rough. They were still putting their cities back together after the destruction. So I find that very interesting about how when we immigrated to this country in the late 50s, it was like so surreal to me, because it really was, like, to your point about Levittown and how all the moms, looked a certain way. And my mother rode a bicycle, and I was humiliated because no mothers were riding bicycles. And I told her that she couldn't do that. And she was like, couldn't have a future in our town if she was riding a bike. I'd be humiliated. So I think there were real differences. And that's why, to your point about the 60s, I think that's when it all kind of came back together again. Exactly. I think that's when you do have the uprising, in Paris in 1968, you have the youth movement in the US, you have what was going on in the UK. I think everybody kind of came back together again, and fashion became more international, I think, at that point.
And also more freeing and physically, because I think about, like, when you compare what was going on with this kind of corsetry, the Merry Widows of the 50s, and then go into like late 60s by the early 70s, and you have Rudy Gernreich, the designer, creating his no bra, which basically was like not wearing a bra at all, because it was just like a thin, sheer cover to your breasts, and it had no support whatsoever. So, like, the dichotomy there, I think, is very clear in terms of how, women are just much more in control of their own bodies by the 60s, 70s.
There are three kind of historical moments that always stick out for me when you're thinking about your mom riding a bicycle. That makes me smile. And they're each a decade apart. 1952 was the first time, or one of the earliest, but I think the first, that there was a pregnant woman shown on television. Lucille Ball wrote her own pregnancy into I Love Lucy, which was a wildly popular TV show. And so for the first time, she was wearing very boxy, very demure fashions. There was nothing particularly avant-garde about what she was wearing, but she was shown as she was a working mother. She was working in her own element as part of that television show. Then in 1960, of course, we get the contraceptive pill. It's taken up almost immediately by about 400,000 women in that year, when the price drops significantly 3 years later. Over 2.4 American women are then on the pill. And then in 1971, the final design technology that I think really gives women agency over their own bodies as a kind of a corollary to fashion is the home pregnancy testing kit. And it's developed by a New York City-based graphic designer, actually, who was at that time part of a Canadian company, Organon, and she looked at the technology that was available, that women had to go to their doctors and had to sort of give over their agency to usually a man to tell them after a couple weeks wait whether they were pregnant or not. They could then do that at home because of the way she packaged it. So these sort of historical moments from the 50s to the 70s, I think, sort of tell us the different waves of agency women start to, and usually privileged women, but women nonetheless in sort of rippling circles get to have over their bodies.
Well, I'm particularly drawn to the pill and what that does to women, and there's a quote here: by the end of the 60s, so from the time it was legalized in 1960 to 69, more than 80% of wives and of the childbearing age were using the contraception after it was approved by the federal government. And this freed many women from unwanted pregnancy and gave them the choice, freedom, of their personal lives.
Sort of yes and sort of no. Like, contraception has been enjoyed by women of privilege much more often than it's been enjoyed by women generally. So I think freedom and choice is definitely always contingent on that. And also, very famously, Gregory Pincus, when he died in 1967 after bringing the pill to market, I think it was the New York Times obit, he was credited as one of the three fathers of the pill, obviously forgetting that Catherine McCormack, a woman, paid for all of that, and Margaret Sanger controversially because of her eugenicist leanings, but was the other woman involved in that conversation too? So certainly it was coming to the market at a moment in time where women were sort of taking it on and using it, but it wasn't even at the time really thought of in terms of the efforts that women, I mean, it was tested on women in Puerto Rico in the 1950s before it came to market. Female medical students, quite famously, were made to take the pill to get grades in their classes as part of a test that Pincus was doing there. Most of them dropped out. But again, there's this history of female agency, yes, but also women being relegated in many ways to the shadows. So it's never as straightforward as it seems.
So if we're talking about the body, clearly there's a pronounced change from the 1950s to 60s. Why? Why did it go from this voluptuous woman to very androgynous, slender, no hips?
Well, I mean, I think that there is certainly a lot to be said for the feminine mystique, and Betty Friedan writing this, and women kind of taking another look at their lives and feeling somewhat constricted by this suburban lifestyle that was kind of imposed on them in many ways. It was really part of this American dream that was promoted by advertisers. It was promoted in imagery. And I think that there's this kind of awakening, you know, and I really do think it manifests itself in dress.
And I also think it's the beginning of the baby boom generation.
Yes.
It was the largest number of teenagers in the
Yes.
60s.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you
They
have
had
all
a
those.
critical mass.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were a force to be reckoned with.
definitely.
Do you think also we could think about the space race too? Because whenever I think about, I'm working on an exhibition on the future just now, and whenever that becomes part of the public consciousness, you sort of use the future as a foil to think about what is wrong in the present. And a lot of gender relations, I think, you know, Cardin was certainly thinking about the future, others Courage through their fashions, but then I think of Goenreich again, and the unisex project that he did in 1970, where he was asked by Life magazine to imagine what fashion would be a decade hence in the 80s. He actually took it to the year 2000, and he made a speculative project that then went to the Osaka World's Fair in Japan around what fashions might look like, and they were totally agender. They really were so prescient in terms of pretty much every MA thesis exhibition that I've seen in the last 5 years or so. But they asked really tough questions about, and so they were lots of turtlenecks, lots of ways to conceal and reveal parts of the body that were gender neutral. It was interesting.
Yeah, it was.
And so even with fashion, you know, it's becoming easy to manufacture, the speed of the technology, fashion's becoming more accessible, advances in fabrications and just wash and wear and things like this. So more people are participating in art design, possibly. And so what does that do to the retail landscape, or women choosing their own identity because there's more option?
I think that's true to some degree, and I think about another era like that, which is the 20s, right? And that's kind of a very big era for a kind of a rise in mass production. And you think about the silhouette of the 20s, how simple it is. It's that shift. It's much more easy to reproduce on a wide scale. That happens again in the 60s. And again, it's like this burgeoning kind of manufacturing world where it's easier to produce those things in larger quantities. So you're having more access to these simpler styles, you know? So I think it's all tied into some of that.
Yeah, and it has a lot to do with economics as well, right? Because it's, you know, sort of the rise of the middle class in the post-war. So there was, you know, there was money to be spent at a certain level, and that market needed to be met through, you know, the emergence of ready-to-wear and everything like that, and fashion, and making those kind of sartorial choices about, you know, your identity through what you're wearing became accessible to the middle class and, you know, even younger person in terms of, you know, before when, you know, pre-war and for a time post-war when it was still really dictated, you know, pretty much from Paris and the designers there, you know, there were watered down looks that, you know, or, you know, Bergdorf Goodman, you know, knocking off for Givenchy or whatever, but it was a different approach to fashion. I mean, ready to wear and that kind of street style trickling up rather than down from Paris, I think really made a difference in terms of, because ready to wear was so easy to manufacture, it became so many more choices out there, you know, so it made it more affordable, but it also made it more, you know, just the choices became unbelievable. So you could, you know, wear your suit during the day and change into your mini skirt at night. And, you know, I mean, you could just be like a million people that you wanted to be, and experiment and have, you know, and choose and play, you know, it became a lot about play and pleasure through fashion.
And I also, oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, and politics too.
Totally,
right?
and
so
showing your politics and your personality and everything.
Graphic T-shirt, or I'm thinking of like Afrocentric clothing companies like
Totally.
New Breed, founded in the 1960s here, where the dashiki was introduced to Webster's dictionary at this point in time because it became part of identity formation and political formation. I often think about the most powerful garment of the 1960s being that black glove that was worn at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City when someone raised when Tommy Carlos raised his fist and said, you know, I'm willing to give up my gold medal, willing to give up my bronze medal in order to be able to protest at the treatment of black athletes and black people in general in the US who can be lionized on an Olympic podium and then treated like crap when they came back to their own country. Yeah,
and I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that's been part of my research is, right, just the kind of, you know, the path to sort of postmodernism and multiculturalism, you know, that we're still experiencing, you know, or reckoning with, or, you know, however it is that you want to put it. But I mean, to your point about some of the marking points in terms of this kind of approach that affects fashion, but also through politics, through diversity, through civil rights, gay rights, you know, all of the stuff, it all comes together sort of in those periods as well. And one of the things that I was reminding myself when we were coming to this talk was just how, you know, the lack of diversity in fashion and representations of women in the media was so, you know, so sparse. And, you know, there was like China Machado in the 50s, and there was just like, you know, Daniel Luna, and, you know, in the 60s, and it was just so rare and amazing to see a woman of color on the cover of any magazine, and just how that in and of itself, you know, not just for women, but in terms of speaking to all of the other change and choice and identity politics that was going on at the time, was really part of that kind of post-war, postmodern, you know, anything kind of goes moment that people were trying to have. You know, we're still trying to have that. But, you know, it was like, it was sort of getting to that. Yeah, it was like very aspirational, but it's, you know, it's interesting looking back to just see how rarefied it was, really.
I know, and I think about kind of what's happening now with agender or gender non-conforming clothing, and it is a bit of a repeat of what Gernreich was doing, and the messages that were kind of circulating around in the 60s and 70s, and it's kind of incredible that it's coming back. I mean, there are more designers experimenting with it now than ever before, but it is this repeat, you know, which I find, and again, it's kind of this burgeoning youth culture. Happens in the 20s, happens in the 60s, it's happening now. It's totally changing the game, and that has always kind of been an impetus.
I also think what's interesting in the 60s is we start to see the repeat of existing fashion. That's when people start to wear vintage. All of a sudden they kind of create their own.
That, like, pastiche postmodernism.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's still around today.
Absolutely.
I know that so many designers reference silhouettes from the past and to incorporate a new present.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very true. Yeah.
And then, so by 1970, I'm thinking of Miss Magazine, Gloria Steinem. She's really advocating for, you have choice, and you need to decide, you know, the pill certainly starting that, choice over your body, choice over your workforce, choice over your field. And so by the 1970s, you know, there's a statistic out there that says something like 30% more of women are in managerial positions as opposed to the 1950s, where it may have been 4%. So they're becoming a little bit more active, but to Shannon's point, we're seeing more diversity, more choice. I'm thinking of the punk movement. I'm thinking of people like Ozzie Clark, you know, a quest for ruralism, of course, coming after the Vietnam War, wanting to go back to a more bucolic setting. So where are we in the 70s, particularly with women's agency?
I mean, again, thinking about historical markers, 1972, I was reading about marathons recently, is the time when women, can participate in the Boston Marathon. 1974 is the Equal Credit Act, so it's the moment in time where, women weren't totally banned from having credit before that, but they didn't need, as a married woman, to have their husband sign off to get a credit card at that particular point in time. We also have Roe v. Wade in that particular decade, and then many workplace policies actually thinking about equal opportunities for women in the workplace, not getting fired if you're pregnant, for example. So the 70s is often forgotten, actually, in favor of the 60s, but it does have this continuing wave of legislation and public conversations around women's agency. And I think the conversations, the kind of countercultural movements of the 1960s become enshrined institutionally in many ways in the 1970s. And I think fashion follows that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know, and I think about all of those remarkable changes that take place in the 70s and how, so I'm working on an exhibition now, I was saying earlier, on gender-bending fashion, so I've been looking at the history of women wearing pants, and it's amazing how until so very recently, women weren't allowed to wear pants in certain contexts, even into the early 2000s in certain workspaces like the financial industry. So it's astonishing that you go through this, right? And it's about more freedom and liberation, and yet there are still these kind of remarkably restrictive rules in place.
I didn't realize, but I
Yeah.
didn't grow up watching Mary Tyler Moore.
Yes.
But when
The
we were
Mary Tyler
researching
Moore.
for items, my
Yeah.
colleague Steph Kramer, who's now at the Met, but really wonderful fashion historian, was researching the Capri pant. And Mary Tyler Moore, as you'll know way better than I do, Michelle,
Yeah.
she wanted to wear Capri pants in the in her
Van
show,
Dyke show, yeah.
in the Dick Van Dyke show, because she said women don't vacuum wearing a full skirt; they vacuum wearing pants.
Right.
And sponsors didn't like it, so she was initially restricted to wearing them once per episode, and it was written in the contract they didn't want them to be too tight. They didn't want there to be, and I quote, cupping.
Yes, the cupping, it was considered more sexy because you could see her
Totally.
derriere. So it was really,
insane.
I know, it's crazy. And also there was another, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kate Thompson, writer of Eloise, performer, and so she developed this line of pants called Fancy Pants, and she was a pants wearer promoter from the 30s on, and she had them manufactured with Evan Picon, and they didn't want to put their name on the pants, so they set up a shell company called Diva Manufacturing that would produce the pants because they thought it would be considered like it wouldn't reflect well on them to be promoting the idea of women wearing pants in the 50s and early 60s. I mean, it's astonishing, but yeah.
But talk about choice. Another little anecdote we were talking about earlier was Nan Kampner, the New York socialite, went to a very famous French restaurant, and she was wearing a Le Smoking by Yves Saint Laurent, and the maitre d' said, "Ma'am, you cannot wear pants in this restaurant." So she promptly took them off, handed them to him, and went to dinner.
I mean, the other thing, to kind of bring some of these pieces together, it's about, a switch, as you were talking about, from European dominant culture to sort of American dominant culture, and all of those things that were happening here in terms of race and gender and everything, and the approach to fashion. I was recently kind of digging back into the history of the importance of the Battle of Versailles, which, the more that you study it, it's just phenomenal how really important it was to bring all of those cultural moments together, so it was the Battle of Versailles, no, it wasn't originally marketed as a battle. It was it was a benefit to refurbish Versailles, which had totally fallen apart for several reasons because of the war and everything else, and the money hadn't been put into it. But Eleanor Lambert, who was an American PR agent who had been a massive supporter of American fashion, she was like, the Anna Wintour of her time, basically. But she wanted to throw a big fashion show at Versailles with French designers and American designers just to raise money, basically. So it was going to be all the aristocrats and, internationally brought there to raise money. But it ended up being this, the designers took it really seriously and ended up being this sort of like battle royale of European fashion versus American fashion. And it just crystallized how passé at that moment French approach to fashion was. It was so theatrical and it was so staid, and they were still sewing all the women into everything, and it was basically a bunch of white guys, and so on the American side they had Anne Klein, and who had brought Donna Karan, and they had Stephen Burrows, who was a Black American fashion designer. I mean, and they brought because their budget was very low. So this has, a lot of, ramifications, but they, not all the big models wanted to come because they couldn't get paid. And so they brought a lot of the new African-American models from New York, and they just made they had the least budget of the Friends. They had no background, they had nothing. They had Liza Minnelli, which was brilliant. But, they just, the French took 2.5 hours and just put everybody to sleep. And then in a half hour, the Americans, was Oscar de la Renta, Anne Klein, Stephen Burroughs, Halston, exactly, Bill Blass. And they just blew the French away, like they were stomping and throwing their, and dancing, and they were going nuts because there was just, it was all about the clothes, it was all about the women. They had, the clothes were so fresh and new and not restraining and so colorful, and the models were just like sexy and brilliant and commanding, and it was like just this huge cultural change. It was kind of like this culmination of all those things that were happening post-war in this one moment, and it changed fashion, but it also changed, it just changed, I think, the way that people thought about fashion and its importance in terms of pushing those cultural moments forward.
I think it's a real moment, talking about the theme of our talk today, about being restrained and advanced. And so here we are, the same time period, the same day of these two schools of thought.
Right.
Yeah. So contrarian.
And it's all there.
Yeah.
I know, and I was thinking about when you look at the actual clothing, like the Halston or the Stephen Burroughs, they're made out of these silk jersey. It's very form-fitting. It's body
everything
revealing.
on the bias.
But very comfortable and freeing. I mean, it was.
I was going to say, we haven't talked about Claire McCardle yet, really.
Oh,
no, we
And that
haven't.
probably is someone that we should have mentioned in the 40s and 50s, right?
Yeah.
Because before this moment in the 1970s, and again, I feel like a fraud because I'm sitting next to people who know way better than I do, but it was a revelation to me learning about American fashion history, doing items, and learning about Claire McCardle and her thinking about the ballet flat, for example, about a shoe that women could wander around in and run about in the city, having that on the cover of Vogue in the late 40s, early 50s, and it being about sort of a casual sports where I think of the corollary. I'm trained as an art historian, so think about the center of the art world being stolen from Paris by the Abexers in the late 40s and 50s, and that's exactly what she and others did for New York in terms of the fashion world. Really took that from Paris even before the Battle of Versailles.
Absolutely,
and planted
and
the flag here.
The thing about sportswear too is that the Parisian contingent for the Battle of Versailles almost refused to do it because Anne Klein was going to be there, and they were like, "Well, she's sportswear," and they were like, "Yeah, exactly."
But this is how people live.
Yeah.
This is what they really
You're
want to
going to
wear.
thank us for that tomorrow. I mean, so it's
And post Battle of Versailles, of course, what you see is designers like Yves Saint Laurent. They realize, right, that this is the future. This is what people really want to be wearing and seeing. And so he starts responding to the street in a very effective way, and creating collections that are very responsive to what the youth culture and what they're actually putting on their bodies. So. Yeah.
Well, we're going to open up for questions in a moment, and before we do, I'm really struck by something Catherine said earlier, which was, we take a few steps forward, then we go back a little bit, then we go forward. And so where are we now? I'm just thinking at the moment of all of my friends, they rave about the crown, and that says something. Are we restrained? Are we advancing? What's going on?
Go ahead.
This morning I read, I'm British, and so I was reading about the royal wedding. And Meghan Markle's mum is going to be allowed to escort her daughter to the church, to the cathedral, before she gets married. And then, of course, her dad will walk her down the aisle. But in the sort of glacial movements of conversation around British monarchy etiquette and what that means for the class system at home, that to me struck me as kind of interesting. We're obsessed by the crown, but these tiny changes are taking place, and that for me was quite a profound one. So.
I also think we talk about how unusual it is for women to have been allowed to wear pants finally at the workplace, but on the other side of the coin, what about men who may want to wear skirts to the workplace? I work in costume design, and I have a young assistant who's has such a great personal fashion style, which includes wearing skirts, and he looks amazing in it. But that hasn't happened yet. I think men need to be liberated next. I think the male uniform is so restrictive. And even in color, it's not even, now it's even like navy blue, gray.
Right.
You know, wearing a brown suit is really being out there, which is,
I know, it's crazy.
I mean, Ronald Reagan wore brown suits. He
Right.
would, you know.
And it's so deeply entrenched, and it's actually a much more recent development than we realize. You know, it's really a 19th and 20th century, this idea of the man in the sober business suit, and we haven't left it. It's kind of incredible. And yet you look at designers like Alessandro Michele for Gucci. There are some amazing kind of gender fluid designers right now, Palomo in Spain. I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries, and they're showing color and pattern and skirts, but it stick?
Come to Scotland.
You know?
Where I'm from in Scotland, a lot of men wear kilts.
Yes.
And they have been doing so for hundreds of years.
Yes,
but even
right.
then, of course, the history of the kilt is a very political one too,
Right.
and has been suppressed at certain moments because of the nature of it, the way it has been worn and the way it's been instrumentalized. But it reminds me of the story that came out, I think, last summer, either summer 2017 or 2016, of young teenagers in a school on the west coast of the UK wearing skirts to school because they were so hot.
Right.
We had such a heat wave in the UK that they donned them and were told they couldn't come to school with them on.
Exactly, and it kind of hit the blogosphere and the internet. It was crazy. And then on the flip side of that, there were girls in Australia who said they weren't allowed to wear shorts for gym because of their uniform. So they were protesting because they wanted to wear the pants. The boys were going the opposite way. It was just it was kind of funny. Yeah.
Gender fluidity.
Exactly.
Well, and then I think so much of change often comes from the young people, and so teaching at a university, I'm, for 20 years, I'm seeing, particularly in the past 2 to 3 years, my students, it's all over the place. They don't think the way we do.
No.
And it's the idea that they may not, if you have a male student, he's not dressed in drag, but he's dressed maybe in a skirt, or maybe he's dressed in traditional male clothing, but with heels.
Right.
And so it's these touches.
Yeah, and I mean, the students are really rethinking everything. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they are not designing menswear or women's wear, and they are thinking really expansively about all of that. And they're also thinking incredibly creatively about just business and commerce and retail and branding. They're so savvy. They're doing, they're definitely inventing the ways people are going to be doing business in 10 years. They're these nascent ideas, and they're students, and they're a little bit, rough around the edges, but, you can see, like, they're just full of these ideas, and they don't feel constrained by, not just by gender norms, but just also, just the rules of 7th Avenue and all of those things. They just don't take any of it on board, and it's so amazing, yeah.
Well, and I think that, social media and the internet and this big wide world that they can participate in has changed all of that. So it's this platform for expression, individual expression, that was never there on such a wide scale. So there's a comfort level with kind of showing who you are and being comfortable with who you are, but then also, to your point about the business side of it, it's like they have other avenues to sell, or to show their work, and that's changed the game,
Great, thank you. Why don't we open up for questions? We'll just take them through the microphone.
Women's wear. With the advent of gender-neutral clothing, men's wear has typically been created to last quite a bit longer than women's wear, which is more perishable, if you see that as a trend that's oncoming.
I don't know. I feel like, this speaks to the history of design, basically, but like this
Designing for obsolescence.
Yeah, that's kind of a post-war economic thing. So I think that suits maybe initially escaped that bit because they weren't considered like the ideal consumer. The woman was buying everything for the home and and being asked to change their clothes 12 times a day and everything like that. But I think that that's really changed for men. I think the quality of clothes and this idea of obsolescence has filtered in every aspect of fashion and design,
Right. I was just at the Milan Furniture Fair, and I noticed a real interest amongst designers across different products, from textiles and carpets to different types of products for the home, of reverse engineering, rather than trying to find new materials to work with, either taking apart microwaves, for example, and using the sand-based elements of them to think about blowing new glass from. Or Eileen Fisher was there and looking at the matumba that usually go to continents like Africa, where they they are either dumped or used partially but not at all, and thinking about using materials again for different clothes or different textiles. However, consumption is predicated on obsolescence, and I don't think it's a business model that too many companies or individuals are embracing at such a rate that it will drastically change the way that we do business here or experience design and fashion here. I wish it would, and I think actually, again, it lives with the new generation of students. I see a really strong social compass in terms of the people that I get to teach, and I feel really lucky to be exposed to that. But yeah, most of it was super bombastic furniture that probably took a lot of money and a lot of new resources to make.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I mean, this is sort of tangential, but it's, you know, it's one of the reasons, like, you know, Steve and I both work at Parsons, and one of the reasons why I was excited to come to Parsons, because of one of the rare schools in this country that has, you know, a sustainability track that we don't even call sustainability, we call it systems in society, because it's really about rethinking the system and not just like trying to buy organic cotton or something like that. So we have whole swaths of students who their whole approach to design and making is, you know, taking those considerations in mind, community considerations, you know, all of these things. And I think that, you know, if you can train enough of the next generation of designers to think that way, it will change the business model, because clearly we're at a critical point there. But the other thing that we do, because I'm involved with partnerships and cultural affairs, is that we engage with a lot of big companies, you know, on curricular projects and think tanking and innovation and things like that. And it would, you know, I think it would amaze everybody here to know how many of these big companies are coming to places like Parsons to say, like, we really need help rethinking our internal systems, you know, and they're really relying on the educators and the students to put their best minds there to help them rethink their systems, because it's very hard to reinvent a business model if you're already like a legacy or heritage company. I mean, it's nearly impossible, you know. So you know, there are like umbrella companies like Kering, who had Stella McCartney, whose whole business model was based on that, and then they were able to kind of teach some of the other, you know, companies under their wing of how to, you know, how to incorporate it. But
like Paul Dillinger as well at Levi's, people like that,
right.
where you have companies who are have the money to rethink some of their systems, and it is at a systems level. He's almost as much an agriculturalist now as he is a designer. He's gone back to really understand the nitty-gritty of cotton production here and globally. And then he's creating workshops where smaller companies and individual designers can come in and learn from that expertise. So it is about education.
Great, thanks.
Hello? Oh, hi. Thank you so much. This was really amazing. I went to FIT in the 80s, and I graduated as a designer. And back then, it was all like punk and new wave and the big shoulder pads, Norma Kamali. And there was no such thing as like celebrity designers like now. And I saw how I always had work up until maybe 2005 or so, working in the 7th Avenue here. And like the fashion illustrator, like Antonio Lopez and all these fantastic illustrators, like you don't see them anymore in the Big W. And I used to get so excited, like couldn't wait to get those magazines. And now I just see how much it's changed. There's like so much abundance, like on all the social media, like everybody's a designer now. And you have to be a celebrity. So I said, well, maybe I'll go into acting and become a celebrity and go backwards, because now I can't get work as a designer anymore. But I got an art history degree, so I went back to school. So I'm just curious about how that whole emergence with, you know, the whole branding and celebrity thing.
Some of my research looks a lot at how and why fashion design education is changing. And to your point, we live in such an overabundant, oversaturated world. And so the problem isn't not having enough, it's having too much. And so you go shopping for toothpaste and you're overwhelmed. And so it's not the artifact, it's what else is drawing you to something. And I speculate that it's the emotion of something. It always has been, but it really is a primary discussion. And so within my own teaching, I start to talk about you're really designing an emotion that the product then follows. And so how do we bring social science research into design? How do we know how people want to feel a year from now? And if you've been to Dover Street Market, Rei Kawakubo does this brilliantly. It's basically an adult playground. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's the facade of the building is, pretty banal. But you go inside and it's all five senses. You play, you go through tunnels, you discover, you play. And she did it, I think, because she realized things were getting more and more stressful, whether it's because of smartphone technology or what's going on geopolitically. And so it's a form of regressional therapy. Yes, the clothing and the product is exceptional. It has to be. It has to be about aesthetics. But what's the plus you're adding? And for me, it's that. And so to your point about celebrity, I think it's a little bit of that. I think it's a lot of that. I think it's a lot of people wanting to buy into a lifestyle and just wanting to feel part of a tribe. I think fashion is very much that to begin with, but more so than ever.
Yeah, and it's always been aspirational, right? I mean, everything, when you think about advertising and all of that, it's all about aspiration. And so that's what they're selling, I mean, that's...
Hi. Ms. Zuber touched on earlier the advent of wearing vintage clothing, and I was wondering if you could speak to the phenomenon of the present vogue for wearing vintage clothing, especially from the pre-war era, and the complications of donning the aesthetics of the past without representing the ideals of the past.
Personally, I think it is an individual choice and how you wish to style yourself. And that I think a lot of vintage clothing, like the older it is, the more fragile it is. So in some respects, it could be used as inspiration rather than something you would actually want to wear. I think as you move, what's interesting to me is now the 80s and 70s are considered vintage, and I wore those clothes the first time around. So sometimes I feel like, oh, maybe I'm going to rebuy something I actually had back in those days. But there is something when you were talking about manufacturing of clothes in terms of right now. When you look at the clothing from the past, even if it was from a vendor that was not high-end, like Robert Hall clothing, or sometimes you see the labels, the quality of the construction is so much more superb than it is now, even on low end. And the fit of the clothes was so much more precise. The arms' eyes were tight, the waist fit properly. The tailoring in men and women's jackets were so beautifully done, even low end. So I think that for me, a lot of times vintage clothing that is more durable, like in garments that are tailored, are just so beautiful to wear because there's something about the construction and the details of them. And I think that a lot of designers that are putting out high-end items, I know that they are copying vintage clothing because I go to a costume house in London called Angels, and it is filled with designers that have rooms there that are sampling vintage clothing and taking seamings and, a certain sleeve, a certain collar, they are referencing those vintage items and restyling them, repurposing them, making them their own, but they are heavily influenced by the past in terms of techniques and cuts and use of fabrics. So that's my personal view. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Well, I also just I don't know if it's necessarily a recent phenomenon. I think that people have been digging into the past for inspiration, forever. Even when the fashion system was more closed, so to speak, the designers were still referencing, history. And then post-war, I think that, people got into buying old clothes for economic reasons, and then also became part of everything else that was going on in terms of identity and gender politics. Because if you were a woman and wanted to wear pants and nobody was making pants for you, you could go to a secondhand store and get a suit. And, so there was just, it opened up the way to express yourself through fashion.
I even think when you think about the late 1700s with the panniers, and then right after that, the Napoleonic era, which was referencing Greek and Roman, a fantasy of what that was. It wasn't really accurate, but it was a totally different silhouette where people weren't even wearing underwear, and women would sit in a bathtub of water before they went out, so their clothing would fit their form. And I think it caused a lot of there was a lot of illness. But you know, you have to suffer for your fashion, I guess. But I always found that so interesting, the contrast between those corsets and panniers, and then going into the Napoleonic era, which was a complete reversal of that.
Right, and then it comes back around in the early 19-teens.
Yeah.
Which they do that
Yes,
directoire silhouette
exactly.
again.
Yes,
and the slim
exactly.
fitting and the corsetry
You know
gets
what's
looser.
so interesting? It's always like the wide silhouette with the corsetry is always mid-century. It always seems to hit
Yeah, that's true.
mid-century. It's
Yeah,
like when
yeah.
you think about the hoop skirt and how ridiculous that
1860s,
was.
yeah.
And it's
And then it's always
mid-cent-
10 years later, it's back
Yeah,
to
It's
that.
back to that.
yeah.
Yes.
Was it Hegel who said history always repeats itself?
Yes.
So fashion too.
Oh,
and,
definitely. Yeah.
and we'll have
one more question. Yeah. Oh.
This is incredibly enlightening. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, and the most, for me, the most remarkable thing I've learned is indeed men have to do so much. The women made so many more steps than the men ever made. In the year 2000, in Holland, Prince Claus, who was married to the then Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, at a very formal function, when he had to give a speech, he took off his tie. Very small step, but at least in Holland, it created some sort of a form of liberation for many men who then took off their ties. It actually took me many more years before I finally took off my tie. But with all the combined knowledge here with you, I was wondering, what is actually the function of a tie? What is it historically? Why on earth is it only to cover your buttons? I mean, what is the function of a tie? Which I'm not wearing anymore.
Yeah, that's it. It's a tough one.
I think it's an excellent question, and I don't have the answer.
We have an essay on it in our items catalog, and so it was written by a really fantastic colleague of mine, Steph Kramer, but she traces it back through about 200 years of history, through the cravat and various other. It's in the same way as, cufflinks or any other small part of attire signal class, signal certain social etiquettes, wearing gloves in certain occasions, what I call the tiny but mighty signifiers of social difference and class difference. It's part of that. And so, in fact, I have the book with me. I can bring it out in a second. I can show you. It's a very short essay, but yeah.
And then like other things, it became, because men's fashion was so restricted and rigid, it became this one place where they could have a bit of self-expression, through color, through design, through how you were going to tie it, if you were.
I was just in Marinella and Sons in Milan, and it was mobbed, and they only sell ties. And I went in to say thank you because we had them as part of the items exhibition. Those are the ties that we showed, or displayed. But I came out and sort of had a chuckle. My husband didn't come in with me, but I said to him, "My gosh, I can't believe there were like 30 or so men really intently peering over." And he was like, "Well, that's what you do too, right?" And so it's very true. It is this one place. I often think about it like the lapel pin too, which I loved mining the history of. Tiny, tiny signifier, but really important over the last couple centuries.
And think about how many ties men have as opposed to suits, right? I mean, they can have hundreds of ties and 5 good suits, right?
Remember that episode of Queer Eye recently where the one way he's able to change the suit is by picking the right tie in the right pocket square. It's great.
Yeah.
What's also interesting is John Kennedy was the first person in a political sector to stop wearing a hat. And so he kind of put the kibosh on the men's millinery industry. Like when you see photographs of Grand Central Terminal, every single man had a hat on, pre-John Kennedy. After that, nobody had a hat. And also Clark Gable stopped wearing a T-shirt when he was in. It happened one night. There was a scene where he didn't have on a man's vest undershirt, and that kind of had an influence on the sales of men's underwear right after that. So,
Okay, so thank you, panelists. We'll still have a conversation. Are we advancing or are we restraining? I think we're advancing, I hope. So thank you very much.